Okay, thank you. So I am Shannon. I'm presenting some work that I did as part of my PhD at UWA. And this work was done with Thomas Stemler, Thomas Jungling, Thomas Limburn, and Michael Small. Okay, and it was all based on a model of the selfish herd. So often when we're trying to understand collective motion of many individuals, we tend to rely on agent-based models. And the rules that we might put on these agent-based models can be quite complex and involved. And for biologically inspired systems, this raises a question about whether those imposed rules are necessarily an accurate reflection of what is actually being followed by the individual. And we think that we should be asking whether these rules could be learnt naturally. So I'm going to start with a really brief background of the selfish herd, which is the underlying model that I'll be presenting. The selfish herd was a theory proposed by William Hamilton in 1971. So he was an evolutionary biologist, and he was trying to understand why animals would hang out in groups. There are all sorts of disadvantages for doing so, and so he thought that there must be a good reason, and that it was likely an anti-predator response. And in particular, he thought that any protection that was gained by an individual was at the expense of their group members. And so to demonstrate this, he designed a thought experiment of frogs on a lily pond's edge. And the lily pond housed a snake. And the snake would randomly rise and eat the nearest frog. And so your risk of being eaten is then directly proportional to the space that you occupy. For individual eye here, it is the red region. It's just half the space or the distance to the neighbor on the right and the neighbor on the left. Okay, so the frogs know about the snake and they know its hunting strategy, and so they start sort of jumping around trying to improve their odds of survival. And so this individual here, I, has the choice of moving to the blue domain, jumping, or to the yellow domain. It moves to the yellow because the yellow one is better. It's smaller and it has less risk there. And that was it. And with this model, Hamilton showed that the selfish avoidance of a predator could lead to aggregation. In 2D, we have these fences between every single neighbor, and not just the ones on the left and the right. And this creates a Voronoi tessellation of space. So individual I has the red danger area that a predator would be most likely to attack it from. And Hamilton noted that each individual should move in a way that minimizes their polygonal domain, and ideally in the best way possible. So that's it. That's the basis of the selfish herd. It's gathered a lot of empirical and modeling support and is generally well accepted as being at least a major contribution for the formation and subsequent movement of gregarious species. The problem we found was that all of the models used proxies to determine the movement direction. So things like move towards a weighted center of mass. Hamilton himself used moving towards your nearest neighbor, basically conceding that actually moving to minimize this space was just too hard. But with computing power now available, we thought that we could do this and implement it in the same way that these frogs on a lily pond's edge sort of moved. So what we did is we just sampled around particle I, calculated the hypothetical domain area that would result from a movement to each of these locations, and then just chose the best one and moved there. And because of this, we called our model the active selfish herd. With it, we were able to see improvements in aggregation, as well as all sorts of interesting behavior that Hamilton had originally conjectured should be seen in selfish herd models. Things like rapid clustering and then subsequent merging of those clusters. Okay, so following reviewer comments on an earlier manuscript of this, that the movement rule was perhaps too complex for any individual to actually follow, we started, and I guess of course this is a model, and it's just meant to represent the intuition of one's personal space and how that space evolves as we move. But nonetheless, we pose the question, well, can this movement, this computationally complex movement rule, be learnt by a relatively simple brain, like something of a bird? And an echo state network is really an ideal tool to test this. So very briefly, echo state networks are made up of 3 parts. There's an input layer seen in red, a single hidden recurrent layer in black, and an output layer in blue. We set up one of these reservoirs to serve as the brain of each agent inside of a selfish herd. So, okay, the input signal then needs to contain information about the state of each agent and its environment to capture the risk that each individual is exposed to. The input induces a non-linear response in the brain, or the reservoir here, and the output signal is a linear combination of the response, and it serves as a steering command for where to move next. And what makes an echo state network special is that only the output weights are trained and everything else is set randomly at the start. Here we train them with a ridge regression, where the cost of the function used throughout the supervised training is the mean square error of the mismatch in mapping the predicted outcome to a target. And lambda here is a regularization term. Okay, and so the claim then is that this simple echo state network, if it can learn the selfish movement rule, then maybe so too could members of a herd in nature. The design of an echo state network that can successfully translate these sensory inputs to motor outputs poses all sorts of constraints and conditions on signals, and the processing power of the reservoir can handle this to some extent, but pre-processing is really required for a good implementation. And I'll run through now choices that we made. These were motivated in part by requirements of the reservoir, but also we just wanted a physically and physiologically plausible solution. There are many ways that we could have done this, and I'm just going to present the workable one that we opted for. Okay, so firstly, the input. So the active selfish model is founded on an accurate representation of our Voronoi tessellation. And this requires complete knowledge of the position of each member of the group. So that level of detail would overload the echo state network if it was used directly as an input. So we need to choose how to present this information. Instead of the Voronoi polygon, we choose to represent a closeness. So this here is a closeness profile of this same Voronoi polygon. It's just one on the Voronoi distance at a particular angle. And we kind of think of this as being a more natural choice of an input because it reflects the sort of apparent size of the neighbors as seen from an individual, or from their perspective. This closeness profile was then segmented into 8 segments, each corresponding to part of the visual field. And we chose 8 segments in keeping with what we're going to use as training data, where we sample 8 positions around the particle of interest. We then summarize the segmented the segment with its average. And this average then evolves in time and forms an input to one of our input neurons in the input layer. We then, sorry, I should have said as well, so we subtract the average of these segments as well, just to ensure that there's always a high spatial contrast. But doing this, we have withheld some valuable information from the reservoir that's probably needed for good motion, namely about the average density. So we include this as an additional 9th input neuron. The alphas here are chosen to ensure a standard unit, standard deviation of 1, and gamma is to ensure a 0 mean. Okay, so that's the input. The output is just as important, needs a similar level of consideration because there are many ways to encode the movement of an individual. So firstly, we had to define a reference frame. We opted for a global reference frame with the vision segments anchored so that the first segment occurred at the x-axis of the individual. The other segments were then labeled anti-clockwise. Secondly, we had to choose a coordinate system to represent this velocity. So in 2 dimensions, which our model is, we could have opted for Cartesian or a polar, and we chose to use a Cartesian reference frame because of the difficulties in training with a linear regression modulo 2 pi. So the x and the y components of our velocity were then used as as 2 separate inputs into 2 separate output neurons. Sorry. Okay. The echostate network was then trained with data that was generated from our selfish herd model. So here are the 8 sampled locations I mentioned, the position of particle I, and the velocity that results in the smallest polygonal domain. And so the position of the particles is used to get our state representation, our Voronoi tessellation, which we then derive a closeness profile from, and ultimately the signal to the input neurons. The targeted output is this optimum direction, the one that results from the smallest domain. And that is used for our training and the ultimately the signal that comes from our output neurons. And so the echostate network demonstrates an ability to sort of distinguish between the 2 key regimes of behavior of the active selfish herd, namely that rapid clustering and subsequent slower merging of those clusters. We got correlations of around 0.6 during the validation phase. So not great, but we thought promising. And so to better understand the prediction ability of the echostate network, the outputs were combined as a pair, so a velocity vector. By rotating, by rotating the velocity vector so that it aligned with the y-axis of our reference frame, we could compare the predicted output with the targeted output. Okay, so here the colors are denoting the frequency that a accurate prediction or a prediction was obtained in that direction. So we can see here this hotspot at the point 0.01. This is a perfectly predicted target direction and magnitude. I should say as well, these 3 pictures have been further separated based on the target speed. So an active selfish member may have a target speed of 0 if it's unable to move, may have a restricted speed if it can move a little bit, or may be entirely free to move at its desired speed of 1. So This hotspot represents perfectly predicted locations, as does this isotropic spot in the 0. The interesting thing is that whilst the echostate network successfully predicts the correct movement, I think more often than not, it also seems to pick up the general directions of what is allowed. So over the top here, I've put these 8 red lines denoting the 45-degree segments that the active selfish herd would normally move in. And you can see that even when it gets the direction wrong, it has at least picked up that typically they should sort of occupy these 45 segments, 45-degree segments. Okay, so investigations based on correlations and comparisons with what the target is are good, and they provide a sort of basic orientation of what the model can do. But performance is, I guess, a wider concept here. And so what we're going to do is explore the actual behavior of these reservoir-driven agents. So what I mean by that is I'm going to equip each agent in an agent-based model with one of these reservoir brains telling it where to move. And we're going to look at 3 separate scenarios of this. Okay, so the first scenario is in a static environment. So I have my the blue particle here is an active selfish member. Underneath this is a red particle that is being, its movement is being governed by the predicted velocity of the echo state network. And so I've just played this. Oh, and I should say as well, so the gray dots, they're static, they're not going to move. And the blue and the red lines here are the Voronoi tessellations for the blue and the red particle respectively. Okay, so the red particle crawled around the gray particle, just like the blue one did, albeit slower. On the right here, I'm showing how the domain area of the particle of interest, the one that's moving, how that evolves in time. Let me just show you again. So you'll see that it pretty much gets the right trajectory, but slower. And that's fairly typical behavior. So I'll show you another one of those with a different initialization. So same again, active selfish member in blue and the echo state network in red. And the red particle gets there slower, but it finds its way to the right location. There are instances where the active selfish member, the echo state network will actually outperform the active selfish member. And here's one where it just gets it totally wrong. So it doesn't always work. But the majority of the time, it does well, and it's certainly comparable. The next situation that we looked at was our particles in a dynamic environment. So again, the blue particle, and I'm sorry, this is a little hard to see. This is the particle of interest up in this top corner. And this blue particle here is following the active selfish herd movement rule. And then over here, the same initialization, the same particle in red is going to follow the echo state network driven movement rule. Every other particle is an active selfish herd following the active selfish movement rule. Okay. So what we can see is that typically the echo state network particle is sort of exploited. It's the slowness of it that we saw in the previous simulations that the other group members take advantage of. And the red particle will typically find itself on the border of its particular cluster. So you can see here that this red particle has a much larger region or domain than the blue one. That's fairly typical. So this is another simulation. This is the blue particle of interest here, and this is the red particle of interest. And again, the red particle finds itself on the border, exploited because of the slowness. Last one, where are my particles? Blue one down here, and red one, this is the echo state network one here. Okay, and same again, the blue active selfish member actually is supposed to end up on the border, but even then it's not got anywhere near the same sort of area belonging to it as the echo state network one does. So down below these two simulations, what I'm showing is this simulation run 100 times and comparing the domain of the particles of interest, the blue and the red one, at the end of the simulation. So in black, in the middle bar, is the domain that these particles started with, and blue is the active selfish final domain, and you'll see that typically they improve, whereas the echo state network typically doesn't improve, and they actually make things worse for themselves. So finally, we're going to give every single member of the herd one of these echo state brains. And so qualitatively, the behavior of the echo state network is, or can be considered to be fairly similar to the behavior of the active selfish herd, in that there is this rapid contraction to clusters, and then the clusters merge. But it's quite different in the manner that this happens to the active selfish herd. The clusters are not typically these long chain-like structures for a selfish herd. So this is an emergent feature of the training. In particular, they wouldn't have seen data like that covered these chains in the training, because they just don't really happen for active selfish herds. So this is just a different initialization.
Shannon, you have less than 3 minutes left, yeah?
Thank you. Okay, and so one more, just a different initialization. So you can see that these structures, they're the chain structures, they really do occur in each scenario, and they're also quite persistent. And that's true even when we include noise over the top of this. Okay, so finally, we analyzed the standard measures for selfish herds. So at a group level, we looked at the packing fraction. Again, blue, the active selfish herd, and red, the echo state network. And we also looked at an individual level at the median domain size. And so there are, like, we could say maybe appropriate trends that we observe for both measures on average, but the speeds that the condensation happens naturally being less for the echo state networks ultimately mean that the echo state network doesn't perform as well when we consider the aggregation statistics. Okay, so I guess in the absence of any real knowledge about what the animal is doing or how they are making their decisions, we'd like to sort of have another level of scrutiny about proposed movement rules in agent-based models. And I've presented one approach of tackling this, of using a trained reservoir computer, an echo state network, and data generated from my proposed movement rule with an agent-based model, and demonstrated that at some level, the echo state network was able to learn and replicate this movement. And so by removing the human interpretation of what may or may not be complex, and just sort of presenting this information to an echo state network in some appropriate format, then we can assess whether the expected response of a given scenario could actually be learned. And if it can be learned by something as simple as the model that I've presented, then maybe a more sophisticated neural network like a brain would also be capable of doing it.
Thank you, Shannon. I gave you too late a warning. You actually are almost done with your time. So we have time for one question. Anyone? I can see in the Q&A there are two questions. Dennis Eroglu asks, I'm not an expert in ESN stuff, however, I always read in recent works that to predict chaotic dynamical ESN is the best approach so far. The quality of forecasting is related with the reservoir size and memory. Have you ever checked the performance of the method for different ESN parameters?
Yeah, we played around with a lot of parameters, and we could certainly get better performance by tweaking things and fine tuning. And then we kind of threw that out and just said, now we don't want to over design this reservoir. We're not trying to predict the motion, you know, as best as we possibly can. We just want to see if it can do it.
Good. I think this is all the time that we have. Thank you, Shannon. For Costas, I will have more often structured approach and actually warn him in time. Sorry about that, but thank you for the excellent talk.